What's up, biology students? Your benevolent biology teacher here. In today's video, we're going to talk about how the theory of evolution has influenced our approach to classifying living organisms. We're also going to talk about how to make some sense of these evolutionary trees, like this one over here, that you keep seeing in my videos. Our planet is an incredibly diverse place, biologically speaking. There are nearly 2 million named classified species, and scientists estimate that there may be as many as 8 million more that we haven't even started to describe yet. As for the millions of organisms that we have classified, there are approximately 60,000 named species of vertebrates, 1.2 million named species of invertebrates, 300,000 named species of plants, about 120,000 named species of fungi, and about 30,000 named species of bacteria. And that doesn't even begin to consider all of the species that once existed but are now extinct. The graphic scrolling behind me is an evolutionary tree, a cladogram, and it is a model used to help us depict the evolutionary history of different groups of organisms living on Earth. Evolution helps us to better classify and describe the living things on Earth based on their evolutionary relationships to other groups of organisms. For example, in this tree scrolling behind me, you can see branches of different colors, and those colors represent major and significant groups, like the plants over here in green, the arthropods here in blue, and the vertebrates here in red. In this part of the tree we are getting to over here, we can see some of the dinosaurs. And if you follow this branch, you eventually find birds. That connection has implications for how we classify and describe birds as a group, specifically as a group descended from dinosaurs. Historically, we have used Linnaean classification to describe life on Earth, a system for naming and classifying living organisms invented by a Swedish scientist named Carolus Linnaeus in 1735, nearly 300 years ago now. This system predates Darwin's theory of evolution by over 100 years and does not take evolutionary relationships into account. That said, it still does pretty well, and Linnaeus was definitely picking up on some of the same patterns that Darwin was. According to this system, the largest, broadest category of organisms is the kingdom, of which there were 5: plants, animals, fungi, protista, and monera. Protista included basically single-celled critters with a nucleus, while monera included those without a nucleus. The others, I think, are self-explanatory. Within each kingdom, there are phyla. Within each phylum, there are classes. Within each class, there are orders. Within each order, there are families. Within each family, there are genera. And within each genus, there are species. And a species is a specific variety of organism. In this system, each organism is given a name according to its genus and species, a practice still used today. Ursus arctos is the grizzly bear, while Ursus americanus is the black bear. And the fact that these two species are in the same genus, the genus Ursus, tells us that they are very closely related, but not closely related enough to be the same species. Humans are classified as Homo sapiens, and we belong to a completely different order than bears. But both bears and humans still belong to the same class because we're both still mammals. Our modern classification system is based on evolutionary relationships, some of which Linnaeus got right, and some of which he got spectacularly wrong. This new system includes 3 domains as the broadest categories of life: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. The domain bacteria contains, well, all the bacteria, single-celled prokaryotes that lack membrane-bound organelles like a nucleus. The domain archaea also contains single-celled prokaryotes, but which are different enough at the cellular level that we give them their own domain. The domain eukarya contains everything else: plants, animals, fungi, and all the single-celled eukaryotes like amoeba and what have you, all of whom are defined by cells that contain a nucleus and other membrane-bound organelles. Remember, cells are the basic unit of life, the first form of life to evolve, And in this modern model, the division between these three domains is decided largely based on differences at the cellular level. We don't know exactly where the first cells on Earth came from, but we suspect that these three domains share a common origin about 3.5 billion years ago. Over evolutionary time, there was a split, and some populations of cells evolved in this direction and eventually became bacteria, while other populations evolved in this direction. On that evolutionary path, there was eventually another split, and the two evolutionary paths that resulted led to the archaea and to the eukarya. This figure is called a cladogram, and it's a model that depicts the evolutionary relationships between organisms based on their physical characteristics, their morphology. Specifically, cladograms show how evolutionary lines, or lineages, split from each other over time due to a process called speciation. This first cladogram shows one lineage splitting into two. This spot on a cladogram, the point where two lineages diverge, is called a node, and it represents the common ancestor of all lineages to diverge from that point. In this second cladogram, we see a slightly more complicated version of what we just saw. We can see that this line has three representatives. Each number represents a taxon, or a group of organisms. That could be a species, or a genus, or a family, or something as broad as plants or vertebrates. The group size doesn't matter as long as that taxon, or number in this case, represents all the organisms that evolved from this evolutionary line. In this case, we have a cladogram with 4 taxa. Taxa 3 and 4 are most closely related because they share the most recent common ancestor, represented by this node here. This last cladogram is even more informative, as it shows the relationship between 9 representatives of the vertebrate group, all the animals with a bony spine. Each of these taxa could be further expanded with its own cladogram to show the relationships among, for example, all the mammals, or all the sharks, or all the birds. While we're on the subject of birds, take a look at the bird group here. In this tree, the group to which birds are most closely related are the crocodiles, because they share a recent common ancestor, this node right here. But are birds more closely related to mammals or to turtles, and why? Go ahead and pause the video if you need to think about it for a second. If you said turtles, you would be correct, and here is why. If we follow these lines back to where they meet, this node here represents the common ancestor of birds and turtles, while this node represents the common ancestor of birds and mammals. The common ancestor of birds and mammals predates the common ancestor of birds and turtles, meaning it existed farther back in the past. Because birds and turtles share a more recent common ancestor, they are more closely related in an evolutionary sense. This is a great example of why you shouldn't confuse physical closeness on the cladogram with how closely related groups of organisms are. A clade is any group that contains all the descendants of a single common ancestor, and clades can be any size as long as they meet this criteria. For example, this cladogram shows 5 different clades. The first and largest is the clade Tetrapoda, which includes all the taxa on this cladogram. This text here describes a derived character, that is, a characteristic that evolved in the common ancestor of a particular group and which defines all the members of that group. Having 4 limbs is a derived character of the clade Tetrapoda because all members of this clade have 4 limbs, a trait that they all inherited from their shared common ancestor in whom this trait first evolved. The next largest clade is the clade Amniota, which includes all the descendants of this common ancestor, meaning that this clade contains all the organisms on this cladogram except for the amphibians. All the taxa within this clade have an amniotic egg, an egg surrounded by an extra protective membrane, and this is a derived character for this clade because it evolved in the common ancestor of all these organisms and was passed on throughout each of these evolutionary lineages to follow. The next largest clade is the clade Mammalia, the mammals. This clade contains all the descendants of this common ancestor, which means it does not contain the amphibians or reptiles. Hair is a derived characteristic of this group, and all members of this group inherited their hair from their shared common ancestor. As you can see, these clades are becoming increasingly specific as you go up the tree, because each clade contains fewer groups descended from a more recent common ancestor than the clade before it. The next clade is the clade Carnivora, all the mammals with special shearing teeth for a diet comprised primarily of other animals. This clade contains the dogs and the cats, but does not contain the amphibians, the reptiles, or the marsupial mammals. The last clade in this cladogram is the clade Felidae, the cats, including house cats, tigers, lions, pumas, leopards, jaguars, and more. Retractable claws is a derived character of this group, having evolved in the common ancestor of all cats and being passed on to every lineage within this clade. Common ancestry is a huge part of modern classification systems and helps us to see some of the problems with the traditional Linnaean classification system. For example, according to the Linnaean classification system, the class Reptilia contains the turtles, lizards, snakes, and crocodiles, as well as several other major groups, but not the birds, because birds are physically and behaviorally pretty different from, say, lizards. However, this kind of classification doesn't work in light of evolution. Remember, to be a legit clade, a group must contain all the descendants of a particular common ancestor, which means that the clade Reptilia must include the birds, because birds also descended from the common ancestor of lizards, snakes, turtles, and crocodiles. Without the birds, the group that we might call the reptiles is not an evolutionarily meaningful group, and that's the problem with the Linnaean classification system. All of which is to say that, according to evolutionary classification, birds are reptiles. For the same reason, birds are also dinosaurs. Take a look at this cladogram and see if you can explain why. The reason that birds are dinosaurs is the same as the reason birds are reptiles. If we find the common ancestor of all dinosaurs on this cladogram, we can see that birds are one of the groups that evolved from that common ancestor. And for dinosaurs to be a legit evolutionary group, we have to include all the descendants of this common ancestor. And that includes the birds. That's pretty cool, I think, because it means that not all the dinosaurs actually went extinct. Some of them are still around, alive and well, eating at our bird feeders, perching on telephone poles, and picking up worms after it rains. And not to belabor the point, but for this same reason, for the great apes to be a meaningful group, that group must include humans. Once again, check out this tree and see if you can explain why. Just like before, it's because they share a common ancestor with the rest of the animals we call great apes, and this group would be incomplete and meaningless in an evolutionary sense without humans. We can also see here why we call chimps our closest living relative, although that relationship kind of only goes one way. For chimps, their closest living relatives are bonobos, as we can see here, because chimps and bonobos share a more recent common ancestor than chimps and humans. And technically, I guess, it would be most correct to say that humans are equally related to both chimps and bonobos rather than just chimps. On the other hand, it would be 100% incorrect to say that humans evolved from chimps, or gorillas, or monkeys, or any of these other taxa. These are all modern living species. They didn't evolve from each other. They all evolved from a common ancestor, this one here, that lived some 50 to 60 million years ago. To say that humans evolved from chimps would be kind of like mistaking your cousin for your grandmother. And while we're at it, let's address this particular image, because unfortunately, something like this is what most people think of when you mention evolution. Let's give these taxa some names, then identify the problem with this picture. To me, what this picture implies is that monkeys evolved into chimps, which evolved into Lucy here. Lucy's people evolved to become Homo habilis, who evolved into Homo erectus, who evolved into modern humans. You could replace these names with any of the other hominids we know from the fossil record, and it would be equally inaccurate. For starters, some of these are modern living species, and I don't know how something that's alive today could evolve into something that died millions of years ago. But also, evolution is not really a straight line kind of process. Evolution goes in all directions, which is why we use trees and not straight lines to represent the relationship between organisms. This version probably still doesn't quite get all the relationships right, but something like this would be a much more accurate depiction. It shows that all members of the genus Homo share a common ancestor, and that this common ancestor lived much more recently than our common ancestor with Lucy, with chimps, or with monkeys. So now that you know how to read an evolutionary tree, I encourage you to slow down this part of the video and take a good long look at this evolutionary tree scrolling behind me. Look for how different groups of organisms are related to one another, and where different groups branched off from one another along their own independent evolutionary trajectories. See if you can find some of your favorite creatures on this tree, and then see if you can tell which other organisms they are most closely related to. You might be surprised by what you find. Because that's the beauty of evolution. It helps us to understand where all this magnificent and wonderful biodiversity came from, and how the different groups of organisms that make up our planet are related to one another. It helps us to understand our own origins to some extent, and how we fit into the animal kingdom as a whole, while also helping us to understand how we are unique and special in our own ways. It helps us to see the order in the apparent chaos that is life, and that is pretty amazing if you ask me. I don't know if you can tell, but I think these evolutionary trees are really cool. In my next video, I will show you how we use physical and genetic evidence to help us suss out these evolutionary relationships and build these kinds of trees, so stay tuned. And with that, I will bring our video to a close. Thanks for watching, everyone.